Doug?
Thanks, MJ, and thanks, Nancy. Thanks, the Kerwin Center for putting this together. I'm delighted to be joining you for a few minutes. I come to you kind of as a fellow traveler, less with the Dean of Cybersecurity hat on, because you're going to talk about technology solutions, or at least like technology mitigation strategies and academic integrity in the session next week. But my experience up till now is coming up through the faculty ranks. I came into administration through faculty development and was a director at Faculty Development Center for several years, and certainly worked with a lot of faculty and students on the kinds of issues that you all are really the evangelists and the leading lights for across the system. So it's nice to come back in that context. And to that extent, I will probably intentionally downplay the aspects of technology that come into play when we talk about academic integrity, or that often are assumed to be, because I think it's important. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but bracketing kind of the question of deterrence and detection, and starting from a place of what is good assessment and assignment design. Also, I'm just going to say by way of preliminaries that there's a lot of information on these slides that they're kind of pedagogically dodgy at times, I'll admit, but we're in times of crisis, so I tried to diverge from what I would normally do with these, because I know that these will be resources that you can come back to, and also because I'm trying to frame this in a way that will give you as many off-ramps for your situational factors at your institutions, and how the common kind of challenges and opportunities we face are going to play out in various ways across the diversity of our institutions in the system, as they should. So a lot of what I cover here is not because I think you don't know these things. I know you do in many cases and are well versed in them. You're the leaders for many of these ideas, but I position this as kind of tools for framing conversations and engagements with faculty. So with that by way of pretext, let's start with context and foundations. Probably the key message here, if I could reiterate nothing more than that, is that all online education is remote learning, but not all remote learning is online education, right? I don't know if I'm the first person to say that. I posted it on LinkedIn the other day, and it seemed to resonate with a fair number of people. Certainly, I'm not the only person to originate the concept, even if it's not been put in exactly that order before. But why is that so important? Because right now, I'm really less concerned for us as higher education about everyone having a perfectly designed online course. It's not possible, but instead, really, it's important for faculty to hear that what we're doing right now is absolutely focused on doing the best for our students and supporting faculty in doing that. And a lot of that will draw from the best practices of online education. But what we're doing right now isn't what good, best online education really looks like. And because of this situation, we're really simply trying to translate what kind of instructional environments we're trying to get some environment online that can support students. And I wouldn't want this mass migration for us to make it think like this is what online education always looks like, because frankly, the skeptics will leverage this to say, look, I always told you online learning was bad, and this is proof of it. So we really want to make sure that those messages resonate, that we are making a mass fast move to remote teaching that can draw on the best of online learning and can set a foundation for us then in turn to really move when we need to into enriched online learning, whether this is a new normal for some time, and when we return back to face-to-face teaching, it won't just be a reversion to the mean. There will be a richer diversity of practices that we can draw on. So the immediate goal here, of course, is supporting faculty and students this term. So it's a beg, borrow kind of situation. This presentation is a good example of that. I didn't just have a COVID-19 presentation laying around, right? This has been a village crowdsourcing hive mind effort. And you'll see me cite my sources, and I think that's what we should encourage each other to do, what we should encourage faculty to do, and what we should encourage students to do. And we'll talk about that when we get to assessments in terms of recognizing the reality of these contextual factors. So the immediate goal here isn't to create an imperfect replica of everything we did in a face-to-face class. There's this untranslatable factor to moving face-to-face instruction online. And because I would lose my I would lose my faculty developer credibility if I didn't have us do some sort of pair and share. And then here in this situational factor, that's not going to be possible. I do want us to do a little activity here and use the chat function to drop in some answers or responses to this. So this image really just gives us 3 different persona of students that we would encounter in a classroom. And so look at that for just a few seconds. And then in the chat, drop in, you know, how you might discern these different persona online. You might even drop in what you see here as well. And then what are the ways that we could ensure each persona succeeds? And I'll let MJ and Nancy tell us if we think we can just do this by voice or if we want to chat or do a mix of both.
I think we're a fairly large group. It may be best to go ahead and do a little bit of chat, and I'm happy to read back on that to you, Doug, so you're not having to track it.
So in terms of what we're looking at here, I'll just, for the sake of time, let me just walk through. Someone says they can't see the whole picture. That you should see 3 figures sitting at a desk. One figure is in the front of the room. This is the person that always shows up early and on time and is eager to answer every question and has her hand up and her books there and well prepared. We have another student who is actively taking notes, sitting further back in the classroom, and seems to be engaged, but you know, it isn't trying to participate necessarily the way the first student is. And the third student is just sitting there, has some materials in front of her, looks pleasant, but doesn't seem to be really engaged in what's going on. So if you're in a face-to-face classroom, you can see these things and we respond accordingly. If you're in an online classroom, what kind of things do you have to be thinking about in order to respond to this kind of persona that you would automatically see, either because you can see what's happening and you react, or because you see the signals the student is sending to you as well? What kind of things do you have to be thinking about in a purely online environment to equivalently meet those students' different responses to participation and engagement?
So if you have a second, want to type some of your ideas in the chat?
I've been listening to music when I'm not in meetings. Maybe I should have had some of that on for these moments of participation.
All right, they're starting to come in. I have to get my glasses. You may not discern between the first 2, but depends on how, oh, excuse me, it depends on what you're having them do online.
Right.
Can't see the students who are listening but not participating, right?
Exactly.
Extroverts and those who would contribute actively in person may not be as comfortable or familiar with how to contribute online. Don't assume that our most active students are doing okay and automatically know how to engage.
Yeah, I want to pause on that one for just a second, because I think that's a really important point, that it's not an automatically given that just as our faculty are in some cases facing the challenge of how to translate instruction online, not all students do equivalently well in the transition to online learning. Learning how to learn in the online environment is something we have to be cognizant of. And so frequency of participation in discussion boards is one way you could perhaps see the equivalent of the raised hand, as someone has just commented. Having students react to each other's comments is a way to give them a different way of participating, right? So that it's not just faculty to student, but the peer-to-peer interaction that we recreate in different ways face-to-face, but in online has to be structured somewhat differently sometimes. And then Denise Yost said something similar about creating different entry points, right? Using the pause, asking them to write something, asking a student to lead. So all of these factors are the kinds of things that, of course, is more or less natural for us to be thinking about, but we'll need to elicit and evoke from faculty as we discuss with them in different forums and settings, how to be cognizant of these things when we think about trying to support students in this interim. Students need to see their faculty members as much as possible to help them maintain a connection, and faculty members need to have an ability to connect literally by voice if possible, and certainly in writing with students for these kinds of persona to be supported. So the value of returning to first principles here in terms of backwards design is really the key to ensuring authenticity. When the conversation shifts in this, sort of mass pivot to remote teaching about the concern for cheating and about authenticity, it's really important, I think, for us to use that as a moment to return actually to what are the foundations of authenticity, is good assignment design. Now, in this case, we're talking about moving assessments online because we're toward the end of a term. And so we don't have the benefit of going back to the original part of the process in good course and assignment design and start with that think principle. But we still have the opportunity in focusing on assessments to create an opening here to optimize the alignment of assessments to outcomes and to, in turn, increase student success. And so that's what how the framing of these next few thoughts are. We can make these imperfect incremental transitions in ways that are academically sound. How do we do that in terms of assessment? Authentic assessment is central to authentic education. And so in these conversations, I want to start with not what is the way we should try to stop cheating, but instead, what is academic integrity? Full disclosure, I'm a board member of the International Center for Academic Integrity. I'm not representing them today or speaking on their behalf, but UMGC, like many institutions, and I personally, as a professional, subscribe to the definition that is the authoritative statement of the International Center for Academic Integrity, that academic integrity is the commitment to these 6 fundamental values: honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, trust, and courage. So in terms of assessment, authentic education, if you define authenticity and integrity in that way, it really pivots in a higher education environment on authentic assessments. So Tricia Bertram-Gallant, and I apologize for bungling the middle part of her name, Tricia Bertram-Gallant, one of my colleagues on the board of the ICAI and one of the leaders in academic integrity and authentic education, has constructed this idea of the moral obligation supply chain. And you can see that assessment is critical to our ability to certify what it is that a reasonable person would expect someone who leaves our institutions with those credentials. And so that in turn, I think, begs the question of what is authentic assessment. It's one of those terms that's often used widely in the kinds of work that people in this group do, but it also can be a little slippery. I think it's important to start with the original Wiggins kind of vision of authentic assessment as activities that are engaging and worthy problems or questions of importance in which students must use to fashion performances effectively and creatively. Learning demonstrations is what I probably would have put in place of the word performances. The tasks are either replicas of or analogous to the kinds of problems faced by adult citizens and consumers or professionals in the field. So authentic assessments are ways to give students the opportunity to do what it is that we are, to apply the skills in a doing kind of way that they would encounter the replication of those in real life outside of the classroom. Again, if you've encountered any work with authentic assessment, which I'm confident you have, this probably is not going to be new or shocking, but these are kind of the characteristics that Wiggins built out for authentic assessment, realizing that how that plays out in given disciplines will vary. So here's one way to think about the authentic assessment in comparison to traditional assessment. Now, let me be clear. I presented this on a side-by-side, and again, this is one of those too muchness slides that I'm not going to try to march through. But this isn't a sheep and goats or wheat and chaff kind of thing. It's not as if everything on the left side of the column is bad and everything on the right side of the chart is good. The point is that authentic assessments overall tend to lean toward engaging and empowering students to demonstrate knowledge rather than just to prove that they're good enough. And there's real value in this approach in terms of our working with faculty to move assessment toward that, both in terms of the academic assessment itself, that is the quality of the measurement that we get out of assessment as an activity, and it's important for how we're shaping and cultivating the social emotional intelligence of students. The moment of assessment, that psycho-intellectual, psychosocial, emotional experience of summative assessment sends a powerful signal and is an enormously shaping force on how we cultivate learners' sense of themselves as academic citizens, and in turn, how they will see themselves in relationship to high-stakes moments when they must demonstrate knowledge or skills. So there's a sort of metacognitive level that that recommends the authentic assessment as much as possible when it is available and appropriate. So you're home, I'm home, let's try this at home. Your an authentic assessment evangelism at your institution has worked. A faculty member is approaching you to seek help in replacing their multiple choice exam on nutrition, digestion, and metabolism. So let's try this again in chat. Take a couple minutes, think about this, and in the chat, suggest ways that we can help this faculty member introduce a more authentic assessment.
I do need a recording of the Jeopardy theme song music, right? I think.
Oh, that's great, Brian. Creating a restaurant menu that represents balanced choices. I love that. Well, and Brandy, I think you're making a really good point. You know, first things first, right? Validate that someone has put their hand up and said, I really want to take this step. And that, you know, just as we are trying to create assessment experiences that are reinforcing and empowering for students to demonstrate learning, it's the same with faculty, reinforcing that they've made the right choice here. Erica talks about creating a handout for targeted clients, people with diabetes, on nutrition. So that actually translates it from more of the consumer side to the healthcare side. Have students collect data on their own metabolism and then develop a nutritional program around their health goals. That's fantastic, right? That does several things. One, it relates to both the consumer and the domestic nature of nutrition, while also thinking about some of the initial healthcare outcomes. And that's the greatest part of authenticity. It starts with the data of experience, the experiential reality for students. Creating a nutrition plan for someone with specific needs, again, but either, in this case, a diabetic in healthcare context, or vegan for lifestyle and health choices. Diagnosing a possible nutritional, digestive, metabolic concern based on a set of clues about a patient. I really like that, right? It's almost like a like the online equivalent of the out of work actor who goes to the hospital to simulate symptoms. I'm a Seinfeld fan, and there's a great Seinfeld episode in which that happens. So maybe if you need to take a break from work, that's a way to spend it.
I'm just impressed how much everybody knows about nutrition, digestion.
That's right. There's a lot of collective wisdom here for sure. That's great, right? So these, you know, of course, not shocking that professionals like you who do this work have great ideas. And that's where faculty will really benefit. And when it happens once, it's a good example to take when someone who might not have their hand up, but who nevertheless you have a chance to interact with. We can use these as use cases for it. You know, it's not impossible both to move from traditional to more authentic assessments, but to do so in an online environment, and even under pressure without breaking anyone's spirit or back. Do we have time for one more, MJ, or should I?
Let's go ahead and go on. I do want to make sure we leave lots of time for discussion.
That's right. So modality is not ethically deterministic. It's not a given that students are going to cheat more online, even though there's a predominance of I think, intuition that suggests that's the case. I work at an online institution. There isn't literally a target on my back. There's actually a little dog sleeping behind me, but there often is a target on the back of online education, whether fairly or not. I don't think the research suggests that that's a fair characterization. In fact, some colleagues of mine and I just released some research last year that suggests it isn't, but we do know that stress and pressure are key drivers of cheating behaviors. So an overmuch fixation on cheating and preventing it can end up inadvertently stigmatizing our mindset that all students, or most of them, or many, are cheaters. And it crowds out the space for us to think about how to effectively design assessments that are really good assessments and not just less cheatable. Whether online or off, the ways to achieve academic integrity in assessments are to align assignments and assessments, to engage in active and engaged teaching and learning to support the scaffolded work toward those assessments, and to focus on designing assignments and assessments for the students who are invested in authentic education. There is no fully cheat-proof way to assess, and we should be focusing on the students who want to learn, which is the vast majority of them. So Let's talk about assignment design very quickly. The basics. This is another way to talk about traditional versus authentic assessments, but I found in working with faculty that it can be a little more disarming to present it in a supply versus construct approach, because it doesn't have the kind of stigmatism that sometimes faculty can feel if they see themselves on the traditional assessment mirror. They can get a little defensive sometimes if they feel like we're trying to stigmatize that. So this is one way to talk about a different way to talk about the same kind of concepts in a way that might create better avenues for having faculty think about constructing authentic assessments. And of course, authentic assessments are a continuum of functions that are not just the summative high stakes moment, but in fact, that's the downstream endpoint of at least a trilogy of functions that start with the diagnostic work of self-assessment and understanding where students start, the formative feedback and assessment that students get while they are working through the scaffolded teaching and learning process, so that they've had time, practice, and lower stakes kinds of input from faculty in order to perform and demonstrate their learning at the summative level. And yes, of course, Bloom's is absolutely essential here. It's not going to be new to us, not going to be new to even a lot of faculty, but as we talk about and support faculty in a moment of particular pressure and strain, it's important not to assume that we're always remembering literally and figuratively the foundations of what we're doing. The taxonomic goal of assessment really is going to be critical to understanding, especially in redesigning it, what's the most effective way to undertake the redesign. One more tool that really simply probably unpacks and presents versions of the same content in ways that might be slightly useful in different contexts. So different types of common assessments, what works about them and what doesn't, because there isn't one assessment that's always going to be superior to the other. This is not entirely accurate to suggest that this is purely linear, because there are places where scenario-based projects and portfolios in the right sort of delivery and deployment can really be a way to richly assess higher order blooms. But more or less what you're seeing is a movement from lower bloom to higher. Again, not a movement through all this content, because most of it's not going to be new, but it is a way to engage, it's a tool to engage with faculty in contexts that are right. So once you've decided upon the activity and how you might want to translate the assessment from a face-to-face to an online environment, then the question really becomes, what's the tool, the online tool or resource that can help deliver that? This is not exhaustive or complete, and it's very contextual on the situational factors of your institution in terms of your learning management system, the enterprise engagement and communication platforms that you use, whether it's Google or O365, and the kind of license that you have within that enterprise system, because some are going to be more or less capacious. They might include Microsoft Word, but not OneNote and that sort of thing. It's also going to be contingent on any rules or guidelines your university has about faculty independently using free trials or that sort of thing. I would encourage us at this moment to be on the side of more lenient, not asking people to certainly go beyond what is allowed by law or policy, but if we can be lenient in letting them do something we might not normally do in terms of what they use to get by in this moment, that's probably the better part of the situation. And then again, a rich slide, we're really winding up here, that I'm not going to move through all these things, but you will have access to see them. We know that in some cases, there are going to be objective exams out there. They're going to be multiple choice. They're going to be the traditional direct objective assessments simply translated online into an LMS. And if that's going to happen, there are better ways to do that than not. And these are really some of the tips and techniques and tactical guidance for how to make those as good or as less bad as possible. And there are a lot of contexts and contingencies in here that we could unpack. I've tried to link to some of the resources that might help you in the footnotes or whatever we call this information at the bottom of the slide. But I do recognize there's also a fire hose effect, not only in the world right now around this, but even perhaps in how the information is coming at you. In concluding the sort of structure part of this, I just want to reinforce how valuable and central the work that you and your teams are doing in this particular moment and before and beyond this particular crisis. you are the leaders and the leading lights of the best practices for our students. And you are at this moment helping students and faculty alike make a massive and difficult, but ultimately doable and even a thrivable kind of task. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about working in a move to online instruction is that it has really been a driver for pedagogical innovation, online or off. One of my favorite examples, pure gravy, is this article I've linked to here on strategies for cognitive presence in online discussions. I've used that in my face-to-face and hybrid classes for years. It's nothing unique to online settings about how the learning science behind the tactical parts of it work. And now we have an opportunity to really take a commitment to good online instruction and really set the bar high for academic quality. And when that happens, we set the high bar for authenticity in online teaching and learning. And when we return to whatever the new normal will be after this, we hope that some of those improvements will be baked in across the board. And of course, the old gospel song about how I got over, well, we're in the middle of figuring out how we get over. And it's less scary when you're on that other side. It always goes better when we start by trusting students and faculty. Most of the students who come to us are there authentically, even when they struggle, especially when they struggle. And the same for faculty. And our role is to support them through that and support the students and the faculty who are really always already centrally committed to what we're trying to do. So thanks. I couldn't go without thanking people. The people in the bullets helped put this presentation together for me and with me. And the people in the bottom bullet are people who have helped me throughout my career, and I find myself drawing on in a moment of crisis over the last few weeks, and I want to make sure they get a shout out. And then some grab bag of resources you can click through when you return to this presentation later. I'm always here to help if I can. Please reach out if I can't help you. I'll try to find somebody who can. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Really appreciate this. And we're going to reserve the rest of this half hour or so to discussion. I think probably with so many people on the line, the best way to go is if you open up the participants window, if it's not already open, you should have a little participants button at the bottom of the screen in the black bar. Then at the very bottom of that window, you see a little raise hand button. Let's at least start that way. And the last time we tried to do that, I think we ended up just going ahead and chiming in as appropriate. But one point I wanted to make here before we open it up to questions and conversation, you know, one of the reasons that we started with this particular discussion topic was that while I know many of you are starting to get questions from faculty about proctoring tools and how are we going to manage exams, I do think the large majority of these summative assessments at the end of at least this semester can be managed in much the way that Doug was just describing. And quite frankly, will be better managed that way because as Paul and Lou Polisi are you know, really starting to dig in on some of the available proctoring tools, there are several things that we know about them. They don't scale easily. They can be difficult to use, and students are in a high anxiety situation anyway. Then they've got the high stakes exam, and now they can't get the proctoring tools to work properly. And suddenly, as the faculty or as the IT shop, you're getting a bazillion phone calls and panicked questions. To the extent that we can encourage our faculty colleagues to move in this direction instead, the better off I think we'll all be towards the end of the semester as we're beginning to think about how we're going to wind things down and do these assessments. The other big question that we have with respect to the online proctoring is are also student privacy issues. We are having a conversation right now with the OAG's office. We talked to them this morning. I think we'll be able to provide you all with some guidance on that very shortly. It'll probably come out via email. And we will have more discussion about that next week when we do the conversation around online proctoring, because and the issues there have to do with the fact that many of these tools literally take over the little camera that we're all staring into right now, and there's some real concerns there about student privacy when that happens in terms of surveillance as it's being characterized. I'm sure you've seen in some of the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed articles. So we'll address those questions next week in terms of technology and proctoring tools. Let's focus today on a conversation around this idea of redesigning assessments and encouraging faculty to do so. So I see Melissa has dutifully used the raise hand button. She's that one in the front of the room, Doug,
Yeah, exactly,
that's already
right?
got her hand up and engaged. So
Good.
we know she's here. Go ahead,
Hi,
Melissa.
Well, so it actually was not about authentic assessment, but I wanted to give a warning back about proctoring, what you were talking about, MJ, because our institution just had to deal with student privacy and what was captured. And I know from our legal team, they want a big disclaimer / I acknowledge all of these things to be put up before the assessments occur, that the students are fully aware that they are being recorded and they signed into this and all these other things.
Okay.
Even more than what the proctoring tools add. So.
Right. Okay. Do you mind if we reach out to you on that while we're having this conversation with OAG?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. How are things going on your campuses? Looks like Brandy, go ahead.
Oh, so I just had a sort of a question. So I'm working right now as we speak, taking a break for this, designing a workshop for faculty about what they can do with their assessments via distance that we'll give in a couple of weeks. And I'm wondering, putting myself in the faculty's shoes, how late is too late? What can I do to help someone who has a multiple choice exam prepared that they've used for this class for a long time and isn't super prepared to change that right now? What are the things that I can do to help them to right? So I think it's a lot of these. I'm also wondering about, in terms of the long-term impact of this and thinking toward fall term, and maybe having some time, and I'd love to sow some of the seeds of assessment redesign, even if I can only give them these tips right now. Do you have tips for that?
Well, I'm sure MJ and others might as well, but I'll just start. First of all, I do think you're right. There's a lot of stuff on this list that almost every objective exam can use to optimize, especially some of these things around distractors and parallelism and just how you ensure there's greater validity in the constructs. But I also think some of the conversations on the right side, especially those top right bullets, no matter if you're using a proctoring tool, no matter if you're locking down your LMS browser, just assume, and I would say be transparent with students, that we assume these tests are open note and open internet at this point. And rather than trying to fight against that, recognize it and make clear guidelines for students about what it means to acknowledge their sources that they use. Clarify what you mean by openness. Openness doesn't mean that your spouse or your friend or your kid can give answers for you. And there are ways to then, if the scale works, to follow up with students on one or two individual questions to see if they can walk you through it. But also with these kinds of exams, it's a chance to work with the faculty member to say, okay, if you've got however many items you have, let's say you've got 40 items on a multiple or on an objective exam, can you recalibrate that and translate? So reduce the number by half of objective items and create maybe short answers that could cover what the other half of that exam was doing. So you're moving them. That's just one incremental step toward, now you've introduced a little bit of construct assessment into what was purely a supply assessment. And so you've moved them to the idea of practice and writing. In that case, probably you wouldn't want to write 20 short answers. It would be probably more like 3 or 4 short answer questions that map to the objectives or outcomes that those other items we're trying to cover. It gets them accustomed to thinking about a different way of building an assessment that leans more toward the construct and authentic domain. Just a little in this case, but that's quite a lot in as well, and might open up an avenue for more conversation as you think toward the fall.
That's great. That's a great tip. Thank you.
And Brandy, I don't know how plugged in you were in UB's involvement with respect to the academic integrity work, but ultimately these are all things that we were already talking about in that conversation. So I think you're right to even if miraculously, I'm going to get recorded saying this, miraculously by Easter we're ready to all start our normal routines again. I think this is still a conversation worth having into the fall semester. And, it's one of those things, once again, where, if there's a silver lining in all of this, at least it started some conversations on a much larger scale than we were able to start prior to this.
Jack, I see his hand up. Can I?
Jack's up.
So a question I've had, and I don't know if this is considered a good practice, but it was one that I used to do years ago when I taught, I would give basically take-home exams where they would have a week. And what I would say to students is, you don't have to study before this exam, that I'm going to expect it's going to take you 6 to 8 hours to do the exam, but I'm going to be directing you to the different areas that I want you to read more about, think about, and answer, so that you're not studying things that I don't think aren't as important in the class. And so to me, one of the pieces that you're talking about that you just said that I think is so important is the way that I controlled the academic integrity is I told students, I'm going to be picking some of you and just asking you privately to explain your answers. And anyone who copies from someone else can't really explain your answers, and not to the degree that, and if they could, then they obviously had mastered the topic anyway. And so I think there are ways to be talking about it, but I don't know if, what I worry about is the model that I used to use, it seems so big that might be actually promoting students to want to cheat more. And I just was curious your thought of take-home exams and that model, and whether that's good or not, because I don't want to promote something that's a bad model.
Well, no, I don't think it is in general. I'm not quite sure I follow what you meant by being too big, and unless you mean like the scale of the size of a class. But I think what you're doing is very much what you're suggesting is very valuable, because what it's doing is demystifying the summative assessment process. Because what a lot of the pressure that gets baked into summative assessments is when students think they have to prove themselves able to recall everything, and that's why cramming gets introduced into the process. So if you do know that there are areas that you're most interested in assessing your students on, and I would assume that they align to the outcomes that you've already laid out for students, then point them in that direction. And giving them a take-home exam and giving them guidelines, I would encourage clear guidelines about citation of the sources that you consult, in addition to what you point them to. And then absolutely, if you don't even always, if you can't speak one-on-one with each individual student about one answer the way you suggest, just because of the size of the class. In this case, if the technology is there, and it's a big caveat, if there's a facility with it, you can ask them to record 2 or 3 minute videos in themselves explaining an answer that you will, tell them at 3 o'clock, and that they need to have the recorded answer back to you within 15 minutes or 20 minutes or something, if it's only 2 or 3 minutes. And that way you can, when you have time, go back through and spot check where you might see evidence from the rest of the exam that you assess, or the test that you're writing you assess, whether or not there's something that makes you go, that might not be right. You can go to that video and see, does the video pass the smell test? And so that's a way to use that same kind of authenticity checker. It also gives a student another way to construct a demonstration of their knowledge in a spoken form. And that's just going to be more effective for some students than others. So I think there's a lot of really good authentic assessment practices built into what you're suggesting, and ways to modify it in these circumstances to make it scalable.
The video is a great idea. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that, and that's brilliant.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Erica. Thank you for dutifully raising your hand. But before that, just a couple of quick questions that we're seeing in the chat. How widely can we share this PowerPoint when it's available? Doug, if you're okay, I think your thinking is it's available for resharing, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
And assuming we don't go in a ditch between now and the top of the hour, I'm perfectly happy to share it.
I think it's just and generally speaking, I think the conversations are going to be fairly benign on these topical meetings, but I just really want everybody to feel like this is a safe space to raise issues and so forth. So we won't want to share the links to the recorded sessions necessarily, but the PowerPoint's fine.
PowerPoint.
So we're also getting a couple of questions about this slide, and Shoshana has asked, what does eschew categoricals mean? And a couple of other questions. I'll let you answer what that means, Doug, but I think also maybe what we can do is actually write out some more description on each of these. Doug, I won't ask you to do that. We may come back to you with some specific questions, but the Corwin Center team can dig into some of these citations and provide a little more explanation on each of these. But do you want to explain eschew categoricals?
Yeah, so, two of the big kind of things to be careful of in writing objective or direct assessments is the distractors, which I will assume we know what that amounts to, or we can talk about, and categoricals. So categoricals are, it is never the case that Einstein's theory of relativity is true, right? So it sets up this sort of place where it forces the student to start thinking, well, is there an exception I'm not thinking of? And it will lead them to then, it becomes almost a categorical can in turn become a distractor. So avoiding absolute statements that will potentially risk triggering the student to think, wow, absolute statements, that makes me think I need to be really confident that I can encompass every use case or factor or inclusion criteria associated with the concept or the idea, and that can amp up the panic. And so that's what the thinking is behind not saying, avoiding superlatives and absolutes.
So in item design, avoiding things like one of the choices being all grapes are purple.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because then the person is, thinking about, well, is in this situation, what do I think about green grapes? And it becomes, and now they're wasting time, right? And that's going to then amp up the anxiety that they're wasting too much time to try to sort out what they think might be the trickery behind the construct.
Mm-hmm. Good. Mm-hmm. Okay, Erica has been waiting with her hand up. Erica, you may have to unmute.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So my question was, I'm a faculty member and I'm in the middle of trying to convert 3 of my face-to-face classes to being online. And one of them is Psych 101, which I have 45 in my section, 45 students, but then there's an additional 5 sections. We all coordinate together as far as the assessments. So we usually have a lab on Fridays where the students work in groups and they work on more real life practical types of problems. Mm-hmm. So how would that translate? Because right now I'm doing it as kind of a scenario-based multiple choice, but is there a better way of doing that in an online format?
The group work, you mean?
Yeah, or at least just real life applications rather than just, here's the definition.
So I'll start with the latter and then come back to the former. That's another one of those sort of, it depends on the technology reality of your university's universe. Most LMSs will give you the ability to create groups of students, and that then will give them access to whatever collaboration tools exist within the LMS. However, that usually will work better when it's been baked into the whole sequence of the term, and students have practice with, again, the metacognitive work of how do I collaborate online. And so I would say in this case, unless your students seem really adept at synchronous or fully synchronous or asynchronous LMS-based collaboration, I would find try to find tools for them to collaborate in a face-to-face way. So do they have access to a Zoom room or to Teams calls that have video components, or Google Hangouts that would allow them to work together in as much of an approximation as what they've been familiar with? That's not because that's necessarily the best way to do it, but because right now it will be the most familiar to them and let them stay on track. You could then supplement that with some of what the LMS collaboration spaces, where they could have dedicated discussion boards that could be a place to do asynchronous collaboration outside of any synchronous encounters you could set up for them through the technology. Again, I want to put lots of asterisks here because I don't want to make assumptions, and I'm trying to throw out what might be possible under the circumstances. And then to assessments, I think if you've got group work driving a lot of the applied learning, you could really, I think, have an opportunity, again, leaning toward the construct side of assessment. Short answers could work there. You could give them short case studies to respond to that, because there you have a great opportunity. If they've been working on applied scenarios in the group work, the assessment can really align most effectively by allowing them to demonstrate knowledge on an assessment that's structured a lot like the way they were co-constructing solutions and answers to the problems that you were giving them in the group work. So I think you got a real opportunity here that your LMS and some other tools will really could pretty richly support.
Okay, those are some interesting ideas. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So one other quick one that came up in the chat, if you're not already familiar with it, Erica, APA has an online psychology lab with some good resources. We've posted it on the Kerwin Center remote teaching page under covering labs. And actually the link there, Nancy, if you want to retype it, is missing the, I think it's missing the remote teaching, or does it go straight? Never mind, the link's right.
There's also a good suggestion about using a mix of scenario assessment plus multiple choice, that and a requirement to explain or justify the answer. I really like that, that not just saying what is the right answer, but giving them a couple sentences to unpack it. That's a really great idea as well. I would also just mention, you mentioned being a psychologist. I have a colleague I work with who actually runs our Center for Academic Integrity and Accountability, but she comes from the psychology world, and she's part of a listserv called, I think, called Pandemic Pedagogy or something like that. I don't think it's exclusively psychologists, but I suspect a psychologist might have named it. But it sounds like a good group of collaborators, and I don't think it's necessarily closed. So you might, I'll look for ways to join that group if it's accepting new members, and push that out as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Shoshana is also suggesting adding to the scenario plus multiple choice a requirement to explain or justify the answer. Okay, any other comments, questions?
And Shoshana, I'm seeing in the chat, I hope I didn't come off inadvertently as condescending in my reply to your answer about a shoe. I probably should have shooed that word and just been a little plainer in it. So let me get out in front of that one.
Yeah, I had to look it up, but that's okay. Thanks, Doug. Okay, so I don't know, Doug, if you want to take 1 minute and go back to your the slide we skipped, one more interactive opportunity to engage in this topic.
Where is this here? Where are we?
I forgot now what slide it was. No, the one where we skipped over the second activity.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Good idea.
That was Paul's idea, actually. He prompted me.
Thanks, Paul. Well, Paul gave me these ideas for interaction, so I should give credit where credit is due here, beyond just having cited him at the end. You've done such a good job on your campus that everyone wants your help now, and that's true if an English department chair is seeking your help, and I say that as a recovering English professor. So the English department chair has approached you about participation grades and what to do with that as you move online. Participation is graded in all English courses, and the department wants to use Zoom for virtual participatory experiences. And so the department chair wants your help to create an approach to participation in Zoom that can be authentically assessed. So let's see what the Hive Mind has to say about that.
Spring Bride. Oh my God.
We want to be sure everybody has their
Well, I think
microphones
that's a
on mute.
good, I think that's a good question to raise. You can't necessarily, but I think you've got to first make a kind of quick impact assessment with your courses and your students about who is in need. One of the things I did that spent some time this week, even in the world where we're fully online, a student used local library internet to get access into the internet. And so we had to figure out a solution, or a student who didn't have a laptop. We figured those things out, but we've got to be prepared to think creatively and tap the resources at your institution that will help you figure those things out. The resources, there's probably not going to be a department of getting students internet on your campus, so you're going to have to be creative about how you manage your org chart to find the people who will help you. Hopefully, you're already hearing some about how to respond to students in these kinds of needs. But for the sake of this example, let's go ahead and assume that we can manage or mitigate those issues. So Doris talks about a 5 to 10 minute short presentation. Brian suggests starting by quietly asking why begin the question with a discussion of a tool. Good point. He might ask the instructor or department chair sort of turn it around. What do you want to do? And I think it's a really good point. Right?
Yeah.
Great backwards design thinking, Brian. Kudos, gold star, right? What are you trying to accomplish? Why your fixation with Zoom? And sometimes that is for nascent fellow travelers in the online teaching world and remote teaching experiences. The technology can become the fixation. Looking at the tool and then sort of working backwards to figure out what to do with it. Very good point. To make sure Zoom might not even be the virtual platform that works best. If it is the platform that ends up working for what the instructor wants to, or the chair wants to do, Brandy says that we could use Zoom reports for attendance, saving the chat as well, and maybe trying to use breakout rooms features to have students speak in smaller groups. I really like that idea, especially recordings of them. But each of these needs to be taken with a grain of salt or triangulated with others, none should be the sole basis for this grade. Perhaps participation grades should be evaluated as to their goals. Poll questions, that's a good point. To Brandy's last point there about evaluated as to their goals, I think that's exactly right. And one thing that could really help in this situation, after you've had Brian's discussion about what you're wanting to achieve, is to, thank you, Paul, start with a rubric. Your timing is excellent. So what do you want to have them achieve for the purposes of attendance? I would suspect in this conversation, if it was actually one that could happen in reality, is that they would be really rich and fruitful, because you'd probably realize that there may be a fetishization of participation that might not be actually doing what the department really wants it to do, or it might be trying to do it in a way that could be more effective if it were more structured. And a rubric can really help focus in on what it is that we want participation to do. And rubric construction is always an illuminating experience for any instructional designer or faculty member in course and content creation.
Great. Okay. Well, we are at the top of the hour. First, everybody join me in a virtual thank you to Doug. I know you're all muted, but yeah, really appreciate